Haldeman had left nothing to chance. When he stepped out of his office on Friday evening, he walked through the restaurant instead of going straight down to the garage. He stopped to talk for a few minutes with Jose and the head waiter, as if it were the end of another quiet week. On the home he was surprised to find that he was sweating, even though it was quite cool inside the car. Haldeman looked at himself in the car mirror, and what he saw disturbed him. A 48-year-old man whose once round face had grown thin with worry, whose shirt collars were now 2 sizes too big. Even his wedding ring was loose on his finger. His suit fitted badly across his shoulders. It was years old, but how could he afford to buy a new one? When Mona left him, she said she would take every dollar of his money, but how could she take what he didn't have? He stopped the Toyota in front of his apartment building. It was a beautiful evening. In Los Angeles the evenings were always beautiful, but this one also held the promise of escape. Haldeman went up to his apartment where he mixed himself a drink and went over the details of his plan. The truth was, he was facing financial ruin. With each week that passed, the restaurant turned less and less. Who could say why? It had been a great idea, even Mona had agreed. With the small amount he had saved, and the money from Mona he had managed to convince the bank to lend him an equal amount to start a restaurant specializing in barbecued food. Each evening at 5, Haldeman's, the blue and purple sign above the restaurant, lit up the Los Angeles sky. The position had seemed perfect, right on the corner of La Cienega and Santa Monica Boulevard. Jose, the chef, was excellent, the waiters were eager to please, yet something had gone wrong. The fashionable crowd had moved away to downtown restaurants, and without them to pay crazy prices, how could he hope to pay his bills? Add to that the money needed for his apartment, for his ex-wife Mona, for his gambling debts. Yes, he had started gambling again, and you had the picture of a man moving fast towards disaster. Haldeman finished his drink and went to the bedroom to pack. If he left soon, he would arrive in Palm Springs in time for a relaxing dinner at that new Japanese place on Highway 111. It shouldn't take him more than 2.5 hours to drive there tonight. Nobody else would be going that way at this time of the year. He silently thanked the gods for sending him someone as stupid as Larry Hyatt. Silly, harmless, never say no Hyatt, who was about to play his part in a plan so simple and perfect that nothing, could possibly go wrong. Haldeman loaded up the car and drove away from the apartment building. Already he was beginning to feel better, although he would not be able to celebrate until tomorrow evening, when he would arrive back in Los Angeles to find his restaurant burnt to the ground. He drove out of Los Angeles, past hotels and factories, until he reached the desert. Haldeman had only visited Palm Springs once before, but he liked it and thought it was the ideal place to be while his plan was carried out. He turned onto Bob Hope Drive and drove towards Rancho Mirage, at the far end of Palm Springs. He thought about his plan yet again. The secret, he decided, was getting other people to do the dangerous work for you. All you needed was simple, loyal people who trusted you, like Larry Hyatt. And like Jose, the chef. Hyatt had been employed by Haldeman as business manager for 2 years, and because of his unquestioning trust in his employer, he had produced completely false accounts for the last financial year. It had been simple enough to arrange. According to the computer in Hyatt's office, the restaurant had enjoyed its best profits ever, with more customers in the last month than ever before. Hyatt rarely came to the restaurant. He knew little of the Mexican workers who were paid almost nothing, or of the nights when there was not a single customer. His accounts were based on false information and wage packets that did not exist. Even when the figures had been put into the computer, they were not safe from Haldeman, who had carefully altered them, just a little at a time. Poor old Hyatt never suspected a thing. Why pretend the restaurant was making a profit? So that the insurance company would not suspect anything when they came to check the accounts of a recently burned down restaurant. They'd have suspicions about a place if business was bad. But a place as successful as this? Never. Haldeman parked in front of the Ranchero Motel. It was an old wooden building which needed painting. It had 10 small rooms set around a courtyard, and a swimming pool that was rarely cleaned. But for Haldeman, there couldn't be a better place. The man behind the desk wore a sweat-stained t-shirt and had a day-old beard. Haldeman wrote his name in the guest book, making sure that his writing was clear and the date was correct. He knew the book would be checked. It was obvious that he was the only person staying at the Ranchero Motel. You had to be crazy to come to Palm Springs in August. It was a time when the relaxing warmth of the dry desert air turned to a fierce heat. Haldeman put his bag in his room, then drove downtown and ate a large, expensive meal. He returned to the motel with some beer in one hand and a bucket of ice in the other. The next day, his plan would begin. If he had any doubts about it, now was the time to the whole thing. But there was no other answer to his problems. He had to go ahead with it. He went into his room and opened a beer. Haldeman was woken at 6:30 by the sun on his face. He turned over onto his stomach. The sheets on the bed were a mess and he was sweating already. In 8.5 hours, Jose would light the burners beneath the barbecue in the kitchen to prepare for the evening customers. At the same moment, Larry Hyatt had orders to call Haldeman from the manager's office above the restaurant. Haldeman had given Larry the phone number of the motel on Friday. He had also given him a small job to do at the restaurant on Saturday afternoon. This ensured that Larry would be in the building as the crime took place, and as the restaurant began to burn. Haldeman climbed out of bed, smiling. Before he left on Friday, he had partly blocked the gas taps on the kitchen burners so that when they were turned off for the night, two of the taps would remain half open. All the pipes under the barbecue would then slowly fill with gas. There would be no leak to the outside air, only a large amount of gas in the system just waiting for Jose to come and light it at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Hyatt, calling from the manager's office, would probably be far enough away from the explosion not to get hurt. Unlike Jose, who would be blown to pieces. Of course, there was always the chance that Jose would decide to light the gas early today, but that didn't matter. Hyde would have more reason to phone his boss quickly, and Haldeman should still have his alibi confirmed by the phone call. He got dressed and opened the door of his room. The heat from outside hit him like a solid wall. He looked at his watch. 7:35. It wasn't surprising that nobody came here in August. He walked over to the pool and put a hand into the water. It felt hot to his hand. All around the sun beat down onto the trees and buildings, and the air was heavy and still. Haldeman drove out to a nearby cafe for breakfast and afterwards took a walk around town before returning to his car. Shop windows were dark and their doors had signs which read, "See you in September." The effort of walking around in this fierce heat was too much and he returned to the motel. When he arrived, he found the front office open and went in. "Hi," said old Ricky, the motel manager. His face still needed a shave. "You sleep okay last night?" "I guess so. Didn't expect it to be so hot this morning." Haldeman sat down in a chair by the desk. "What do you think the temperature is?" "Oh, 110, 115, about now," said Ricky, looking out of the window. "You just wait till after lunch though, if you want to feel some real heat. It'll be up in the 120s by then." "Why do you stay here in August?" asked Haldeman. "I have to get this place ready for when we get busy again. I'm having a new roof put on, and new tar and tiles put down in the courtyards where the ground's cracked open with the heat. I have to almost rebuild this place every summer. We get storms, and floods, and heat waves in August that kill half the old people. You want a beer?" He pushed an ice-cold can of beer along the desk. A short time later, Haldeman returned to his room. While he was waiting for his call, he decided to sit and read outside under one of the faded orange sunshades surrounding the swimming pool. After only a few minutes, he was asleep. The book fell to the ground and Haldeman woke up. He was suddenly thirsty. Beyond the blue pool stood rows of trees, and beyond those lay the desert, and then the mountains. Somewhere over toward the front office, hidden by trees, Mexican workmen called to each other as they carried in new orange tiles ready for repairing the courtyard. He got up and walked back to his room. Inside it was cool and dark. 1:45. 2¼ hours before Jose reduced his restaurant to a car park, and Haldeman was provided with a solid, unbreakable alibi. He would have to make sure he was near a phone when Hyatt's call came through. It was at this point that Haldeman noticed the lack of a telephone in the room. "No, sir, one thing we haven't got yet is room phones," said Ricky, picking at his teeth with a piece of paper. He sat behind the reception desk with what was left of a plate of fried chicken in front of him. "We don't get asked for them. People come here to get away from them. Listen, I'm expecting a very important phone call in a couple of hours," said Haldeman. "I gave them the number here." "Where did you get that from?" asked Ricky. "From the telephone book." "Oh, that number, that's the old number. You mean I won't get the call?" "Oh, it rings here still, but it's out the back on the old phone now. We changed the numbers last year." Haldeman sat back, relieved. "Where can I find the phone booth?" he asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Just go out behind the workmen to the back courtyard and it's straight across. Thanks, I'll see you later." Haldeman got up from the chair and went out into the sun. At 2:30, he left his room with a beach towel and a glass filled with ice and whiskey. He knew he probably shouldn't drink whiskey before the call, but he needed it. Round the back of the motel, he found a large courtyard. Along one side a pair of faded sunbeds stood in the shadow of the wall. In the opposite far corner of the courtyard stood the phone booth, little more than a payphone on a metal stick. Below it, a faded phone book hung on a chain. The heat in the courtyard was amazing. Protected from the desert winds, it lay sheltered and silent at the back of the motel grounds. Haldeman lay down on one of the sunbeds. After a few minutes, he fell into a half-sleep, and began to imagine the chef coming into the restaurant. He would be surprised to see Hyde there, and the two men would talk together for a minute or two. Jose would then walk onto the kitchen, put on his chef's clothes, and wash his hands. Meanwhile, Hyde would move up to the manager's office and sit at the desk with his papers. Haldeman turned onto his side and drank the whiskey before lying back on the sunbed. It was so hot here, hot enough to start a barbecue restaurant that worked on the natural heat of the sun. Yes, maybe that was what he would do. Maybe. The phone was ringing. Haldeman sat up on the sunbed and looked at his watch. It was exactly 3 o'clock. He must have fallen asleep. Jumping up, he looked around for his shoes and shirt, then across at the ringing telephone on the far side of the courtyard. He wiped his sweating face. The ground between him and the telephone would be burning hot, but he would have to run across. He couldn't afford to miss the call, his alibi depended on it. He ran towards the telephone booth, running as lightly as possible, but had only taken 3 steps before becoming aware of something wrong. The pain which had begun to cut into his bare feet was obviously caused by the sun-baked ground, but the ground did not feel solid under his feet. At the next step, the bottom of his right foot felt as if it was on fire, and he screamed. In the distance, the telephone rang on. He looked down and saw the floor of the courtyard boiling in the heat, and this time he was forced to pull his left leg forward to keep moving. The sharp movement tore a piece of skin from the bottom of his left foot, and he fell forward onto one hand and a knee, crying with pain. He could see the telephone, no more than 8 feet away, ringing and ringing. All around him the surface of the courtyard was boiling. The Mexican workmen had only finished putting down the new tar yesterday. They had covered the surface with sand, then moved on to another part of the grounds. But because of the fierce heat, the tar had failed to harden. And today, the sun had brought the tar back to an almost liquid state. Unable to support his body on his burning hand and knee, Haldeman fell screaming, face down onto the courtyard. Liquid knives of fire burned into his skin. He tried to turn and pull himself free, but every time he moved more skin tore loose. Larry Hyatt slowly put down the telephone. That was strange. Haldeman had particularly asked him to call at this time. As it happened, he needed to speak to the boss anyway, as there was a problem with the restaurant. An hour ago, Jose the chef had called to say he was sick, and so far they had been unable to find another chef. It looked as if they would not be able to open at all tonight. Oh well, he would try again in a few minutes. Haldeman was stuck by his bleeding, raw face in the hot tar. His chest, knees, and legs were also stuck, and the more he struggled, the more he stuck. His screams became higher and higher as the hot black liquid finally touched his right eye and boiled it white. When the telephone rang again, he was still alive, though not conscious. Blood and tar had dried across his torn back, and most of the skin from his head and body lay stuck in the tar. Altogether Hyatt rang 4 times, and for the first 3 Haldeman was still alive. But then the sun pushed up the temperature a further few burning degrees. The red thing that had been Haldeman moved for the last time as the sound of the telephone faded in its ears, and the chances of healing its torn body in the coolness of the motel's reception office disappeared in the cruel, unforgiving heat.